preservation of and increased access to the 92nd Street Y Humanities Audio Archives is generously funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
Dr. Margot Krebs.
Thank you, Rabbi Miller. Good evening, everybody. We are really very pleased this evening to welcome Ann Birstein. She is the author of 9 books, including 7 works of fiction and a biography of her father called The Rabbi on 47th Street. That may be your favorite book. I don't know. We'll have an opportunity to hear about it later on. And her short stories and essays have also appeared in major publications, such as The New Yorker, The New York Times, etc. So, today we are here to talk about what I saw at the fair. You begin your story with the trip that you took to the town of Birstein in Germany, which bears your father's family name. And the episode, I guess as I read it, points to your overriding consciousness of yourself as a child of immigrants and a Jew, and ends on an unfortunate incident, which you describe with your usual wit. You fell in front of the castle, in front of the Birstein Castle, bloodied your nose, and disgraced yourself totally, or at least reminded yourself of the place that you assumed in the world. You said, "I looked like a Jew who had been beaten on Kristallnacht." So to my mind, that kind of, and I'm sure you used this episode to introduce your book for a reason. Is it fair to say that this sense of displacement and inferiority that comes across kind of plagued you for much of your life?
Displacement, maybe? No.
No.
I don't think so. Not inferiority, certainly. I think being a Jew is a great vantage point. I don't feel that, you don't belong. And that's kind of marvelous because you have a terrific perspective on what goes on. I think the point about this is that I did play with the idea, since my name is peculiar. It is spelled oddly, and I got 2 letters this week in which it was misspelled. And there was a point at which I was going to marry Leonard Bernstein and Daniel Birstein and Robert Birstein, and so that my name would be Ann Birstein.
Right.
But, and then I met a guy named More Just, who's a novelist, and he said, "Marry me first, and then your name will be Ann Just Birstein." Anyhow, there's this place, you see, with spelled exactly the same, Birstein. And I had this fantasy that I was a princess, and I would come back and, in the back of a train, I think, and the villagers would dance around me and so on. And I was going to go there originally many years before, but then I got married and my name got changed and I couldn't go. So I meant to go, I meant to be there all the time, but I knew it was a joke and a fantasy. And they were wonderful. They gave me this huge reception and the press was there, and and they didn't seem to feel it was my castle or my sawmill or my court of justice, actually. They're funny about that. But they really welcomed me, and I was the only Birstein in Birstein. And then at the end of all of this, I fell. But that was kind of, I knew that I wasn't Birstein from Birstein, and I knew I was not a German princess, and I knew I never wanted to be a German. And so that to look at this face on Kristallnacht, just, I guess a kind of little punishment maybe for trying to pass myself off. But
As a princess?
As a princess, yes. Yes.
Well, we all try.
Yes. Well, this was a setup. I had a castle and the whole thing.
Right. Most of us don't start with the castle. So
yes,
at
there
least,
you go.
You started with the castle.
And a Fürst and a Fürstin and everybody.
Well, let's talk a little bit about your father. He was very successful at what he did, and he carved a niche for himself as kind of the rabbi to the stars on Broadway. So can you tell us a little more about him?
Oh, yes. Well, as I said, you said I did write a book about him. He was the most amazing guy I have ever met. And what was nice writing about him was that it turned out I didn't have an Electra complex because everybody really loved him, not just me. And that was very reassuring. He came from a yeshiva in Lithuania called the Slobodka Yeshiva, and he had many, many trials and travails before he came to this country. He was a little kind of natty guy and very brave, and finally he wound up at this synagogue, which was called the West Side Hebrew Relief Association. And it was one of those cooperative help things where they buried each other and stuff like that. And then he realized that he was a block from Broadway. And actors were very much infra-dig at that point. They were not useful to Orthodox Jews. And he made a point of inviting them, and they came. Not legit actors so much as vaudeville types and sports types and stuff like that. And so it had a split kind of personality, the synagogue. It had the West Side, which was not like East Side Jews. They were petit commerçants. They had stores and they had businesses and they were glaziers and so on. And that was our regular group. And then what we called the famous celebrities. And they would come and on the holidays, and also they would be part of the show. And they loved him because he really was kind of perfect for an actor's rabbi. He loved them too.
In what way perfect for an actor's rabbi?
Well, he was himself very handsome, very dapper, very natty. He was short. As I say in my book, he was very little, and everybody called him Rab or the Little Rabbi. And everybody knew why, except my mother, who was 4 feet 9.5. And she said she always wanted to marry a tall man, and she thought she had. But he loved them because he understood their problems too. He understood that they really wanted to be good Jews in their fashion. He had like 2 morning services, one later, because he knew they slept. They worked late. They would call him and say, I have yard side for my mother, but I'll be on the road. What should I do? I can't. And he'd say, just say Kaddish in your room. And so it was part of his own tradition too. And he was pretty, he was cute. And then at the end that we had this, is this more than you want to know?
No, well, it's never more than we want to know. But now, you mentioned that he had all kinds of connections, and I was wondering how. I mean, here's a man who's an immigrant. How does he manage to, as I said before, find this niche for himself and
he was very sympathetic toward the actors. The regular community was not so sympathetic toward him because he was young and kind of, I don't know, I suppose revolutionary in a way. But it was his turf, and he would just walk up and down, and everybody knew him, and the guy had connections for everything, and his connections had connections. And I remember once Bella, he needed a tuxedo. So, my father, of course, knew probably everybody who ever made a tuxedo in New York, and so we sent Saul to this guy. And at the time, it was midnight blue, fashionable, right? So Saul goes to a partisan review party and meets Philip Robb, who says, "What kind of color is that?" And Saul said, "It's Annie's fault, it's Annie's fault." He knew painters, he knew, I never spent a penny on a theater ticket or anything like that. He just, and they all knew him, it was his beat. And he had that kind of personality,
Well, you speak about distinct influences on your life, and I assume then that your father was one. and Alfred Kazin the other. And we'll talk about Kazin in a moment. But what specific influence do you think your father had on you?
I think he was the bravest person I ever met. And as I get older, that becomes more important to me. And I remember he used to say to the shamans, they were always trying to raise money, and say, if they throw you out one door label, go in another one. And I think if I had something that I really believe in, it is that when they throw me out one door, I hear him say, Hanala, go in another one. And he just never said die. He just didn't. And he was very humane, much more than my husband. I mean,
We will talk about that.
No, he was much more tolerant of people and different ideas and stuff like that.
Your book is called an autobiography, and I notice that a lot of people who write about themselves these days tend to speak of memoirs.
I know.
So how do you see the difference, and why did you choose to?
It does start at the beginning of me, and it is my whole life until now, which I hope will go on a little while longer. And I see memoirs as as restricted to either a particular time or a particular subject. For example, the New York intellectuals come up in this. And if it were a memoir, I would be writing my memories of that group. But it's not. It's a whole, I like to think of it as a long narrative. Yeah.
Okay, good. You come from a large family, and most of them followed a rather conventional path, I guess, in life, except your brother, whom you idolized in your youth, and who had artistic aspirations, but I gather who seemed to have failed in many ways, and yet you succeeded. So, it's always puzzling to know why or how two siblings who perhaps aspired to the same things end up, with
different
places.
Yeah. Well, he was much older, and so he came from, he was 15 years older than I, and he really was a Depression kid, and that made a big difference. They were, my two older sisters and my brother were like people in an Odette's play. They aspired and aspired, but they kind of were licked, from the start, and it was sad. It was just, they had no sense that you could aspire and really succeed. And I don't know that I did, but I was a different generation altogether.
Born under a lucky star?
No, just born under a later star.
A later star. Queens College. Okay. So in your day, I guess it was what one might call a happening place, as you describe it. And it was co-ed, and you make a very big deal of that. So I would have thought that this would have been a shock, to the system of a young girl from an immigrant household, daughter of a rabbi, and so on. And yet you seem to have adapted extremely well. I mean, first of all, you mentioned this was 1944, and so at first there weren't as many men as you had hoped, but that was soon rectified, and you seem to have had countless boyfriends.
Countless? Well, I had a very tall one.
I'm sorry?
A very tall one.
A very tall one. No, well, there were several, and to get personal,
yes,
since these are things that you mention in your book, I suppose. Anything you mention in your book,
it's fair game. Yes,
fair game. Losing your virginity was not such a big deal.
Oh, it was marvelous.
Well, but again, this was maybe it wasn't 44, maybe by now it was 45, 46, I don't know, I'm not counting, but in any event, rather unusual for a young woman of your generation and background, I would think. And you mentioned, at some point you refer to, I think, a forbidden passion. I think those are the words that you use, which almost sounds as though you, back then, saw yourself as defying something?
Defying?
Yeah,
I guess so. Yeah, I was defying three sisters for openness. I don't know that I was defying my father. He was much more sophisticated, but I can tell you, all my three sisters were all virgins when they got married. And that seemed to me a very strange state. I mean, to this day, I can't imagine loving somebody enough to marry them but not sleeping with them. It seems immoral. But it really does, yeah. So, but I was madly in love with this guy, and it took me a long time to persuade him to come around.
Okay, well, that was not the conventional view, though. You must admit that was not.
It was not unconventional at Queen's College. It was unconventional in my family.
In your family, yes. And I would imagine other people of a similar background to yours.
Yes.
So we learn, of course, about how you perceive the world because the point of view is yours. But had this been a novel, I mean, just for a moment, imagine,
Yes.
step outside of yourself and written from an omniscient point of view. How do you think you would have described this young woman?
This particular
young woman, 1944, 45, 46, at Queen's College.
That's like Marjorie Morningstar.
Really?
Yeah. Or Scarlett O'Hara. I mean, it's somebody just knowing this wasn't all there was to it, that's all. So, also, it was a very patriarchal society in addition. So I just knew that wasn't right. And I just knew that to be condescended to by people who weren't worth my spit, just because they were men seemed wrong to me. The whole thing seemed wrong. And I guess I just had aspirations, that's all. But I had aspirations that I thought were possible. Also, that is a period, by the way, I was not alone in that. A lot of my classmates all aspired to be writers, composers, and you know what? We all did it. It was the end of the war, and that was a time when things seemed possible. We thought we were going to be like people in the 20s, actually. Then the 50s came in and closed in on us, and then we were supposed to be good wives and mothers all over again. But in the 40s, we were very, very open to change and the arts, and so it was a very exciting time.
And of course, these were also the Holocaust years. And then after the war, a nephew of your father's turns up, and you become aware of life outside of your immediate concerns. Yet I notice that you write about it today with a kind of ironic detachment, almost mocking the young idealistic you, because you say, I would make it up to poor Joseph. I don't know if you called him Joseph or Yosef. I would be the only person who understood him. He would be my cause. And I mean, I think I'm right in reading irony into that. And then later on you say he was inert, heavy, like original sin. I wonder
Did I say that? Yeah.
Well, I read it. I don't know. Care to explain? He was inert, heavy, like original sin.
That's good.
It's a turn of phrase, but what did you mean by it?
And your question?
What did you mean by it?
What I meant that he represented to me all the sins that had been done against us. He was my own guilt. He was my own cousin.
Why would you have been guilty?
Because he was my cousin, because I had come out scot-free. I lived in America. I knew they were all dying, that they were all dead. He was the only person left of this family. And so I was going to expiate pay for my good luck, because I always had that sense of it. I mean, my earliest memory is of Mussolini talking to the League of Nations and of Hitler ranting. I mean, we always knew we were on that edge, And so there he was, and I was the big idealist because, of course, my father did not understand for 1 minute what this boy had gone through. And what my father understood was this guy came, and he came with a gold watch for me and one suitcase, and he gave me the gold watch, and my father snatched it away. And I said, Daddy, how can you? Again, the idealist, my father being this wicked person. Well, of course, what my father did understand, this guy was a very odd person. Evidently, suffering doesn't make you noble. He was an operator. And he thought that the only reason my father had brought him over was to marry me, to unload this daughter. And my father understood that this watch meant we were engaged. And he whipped it away. And then he later on made a serious pass at me.
And that was the end of him? And that was the end of him?
I regret to say, well, I was in bed, and I remember he had a hairnet and a lot of pomade, and he was not, and had a long pinky nail, which didn't anybody ever heard of that, pinky, to do stuff. I mean, he was an upholsterer, and that pinky nail helped. Anyhow, he was not the man of my dreams exactly, and I was in bed, and I woke up because he was sitting on the edge of my bed. And he said, "Aren't you afraid, Chanala," he said to me in Yiddish, "that I am next door to you? Aren't you afraid?" And I said, "No, I'm not." And he said, "I am." And I, oh God, so what do? Do you sleep with this guy out of a sense of guilt? Not this one. So I just buried my head under the covers, and then furthermore compounded this guilt by telling my father about it, because of course my father didn't begin to understand this guy and the tragedy he had gone through. Only I did.
And do you know what happened to him? Did you keep
Yes,
in touch
he
with
came
him?
by. He came by again and again, and he went to live in Brooklyn. But he had other relatives, and my father found him a job. I mean, it wasn't that. It was just idiot. Just an idiot.
So back to Queens College. In the meantime, you earned very early literary success with a story about a rabbi secretary and a synagogue. And that afforded you an entree into the world of the literati. And a summer at the Kenyon School in Ohio, where you met more luminaries in American literature. And meanwhile, your book is published. Your father takes it personally, predictably, understandably, is offended by it.
Oh, yes.
And your book is reviewed by Midge Decter in commentary. I think you don't have kind words to say about
Midge
the review
Decter?
or the reviewer.
Well, I didn't understand the review. It was my first experience with what I now know is a common type of review, which isn't about your book at all. It just goes on and on to make some other point. And her point was about rabbis' wives. I just didn't understand what she thought about my book. So I really was at a disadvantage there. I remember once, just to jump forward, Alfred once did this very long review in the New York Review of Books, went on for paragraphs and columns and so on. And then I said, just oddly, "Did you like it, Alfred?" And he said, Anyhow, that was a style. So, and now, of course, my feeling about Midge Decter is very low indeed.
Now meaning?
Politically.
Politically.
Yeah.
Well, so at this point in your life, enter Alfred Kazin. And you write, "And he was scary." And his first remark to you was, nice legs.
Yeah, not literary.
Okay.
No.
Pardon me?
Not literary, no.
So between his being scary and the sexual attraction came a 30-year marriage that ultimately failed, ended painfully. Well, as you describe Kazin now, as I was reading, was trying to see what you found so attractive about him. And I understand why it's perhaps difficult for you to explain that attraction, given the fact that over 30 years your feelings obviously changed. But can you try to help us understand?
I still love him, actually, because he was a most remarkable man. He was brilliant, and a terrific writer. Not quite a genius, but almost. And he can be as charming and compelling as anybody I had ever met. Plus, he was the one to take me out of this place that we discussed. You know, with this totally bourgeois household, and he knew everybody, and he knew everything actually.
And power is sexy. And power is sexy.
Oh yes, and he was very handsome too in his fashion, and you know, he was only 35 years old, and very much. I remember my father said, "How old is this man?" And I said 35, and he said, at his peak. And I said to Alfred, so it's downhill from here on. He was not very funny. I mean, he didn't have a great sense of humor. And he was always saying, "What are you laughing about?"
Well, you made up for it. I can tell.
But he was, I mean, women fell for him all the time. It wasn't just me. I mean, I remember going to parties and literally being pushed against the wall by some woman eager to speak to him. And then power is an aphrodisiac, isn't it? Mr. Kissinger tells us.
Right.
And he was a learner. I mean, he knew stuff. He really did. He knew stuff.
So his world became your world, and you met everyone who was anyone among New York intellectuals, from Irving Kristol to Robert Lowell to Ralph Ellison, Richard Hofstadter, Saul Bellow, whom you just mentioned, for whom you seem to retain a soft spot.
Oh, yes. Elie Wiesel.
Elie Wiesel, you mentioned, Isaac Bashevis Singer. I mean, the list goes on and on.
Yes, it does.
That was very exciting.
It was exciting. It was. I mean, it was a great gift. On the other hand, I had the sense more and more that it didn't have anything to do with me, and it didn't really, because based on my own work and my own achievements, I wasn't in that league at all. It was funny, I was thinking just yesterday, we were at a symposium, remember, and the man mentioned James Baldwin. And I knew Jimmy Baldwin in Paris is another name for you. But I remember, and we were great friends, and then I remember one night he came to visit us when I was married, and he was talking to me. And I remember being surprised that he was talking to me, not to Alfred. That went through my head, and I thought, oh my God, that I was surprised that he was talking to me. I mean, he would ordinarily be talking to Alfred, and I would be allowed to speak up.
And how do you account for that? How do you account for the fact that it was James Baldwin who was speaking to you and so very few other people of that
Because
league?
he knew me before. He knew me before I was married and had that new identity. We had been pals.
Some of these famous people had wives, and they seem to have all been relegated to the outer circle.
Absolutely.
As you were also kind of marginalized. And I gather that there were two main hurts in all of this. One is that your contributions to Kazin's books were considerable. And of course, the other was that your own work, which you continued, really received very little credit among these people. Yet, again, if I ask you to step out of yourself and try to think about how your work, your books, might have been different if you hadn't been in this steamy environment.
I think it helped my work, I really do. I think it would have been more rudimentary, more primitive. I learned a lot about writing, reading these guys.
Well, we all have read them.
Yeah.
But we didn't live among them.
No.
So, I wonder how that touched.
Well, as I say, it was a kind of double-edged thing. On the one hand, I felt totally snowed by them, and I was right. I mean, they were somebody. They were amazing. I just happened to walk into this amazing group of people by any standards, And at the same time, though, the ante for myself went up, and I really got to be stronger, more forceful. Until then, I was writing sort of like little New Yorker stories, which were tiny little slices of things and very sensitive Well, I got desensitized too, I think. I think it did me a lot of good. Not professionally, but artistically.
Not professionally because
No, but
there was no recognition.
none. I told that story about Ralph and Saul coming, there was a symposium at Smith College, and Saul was one of the speakers. It was on the novel, and he came with his friend Ralph Ellison, and I put them up in my house, my pals. And William Maxwell was there, and he mentioned a book I had just written, and I was so thrilled. I thought I would die of happiness. And then afterwards, I said something to Saul, and Saul said, "Well, he's a nice guy." Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And then, when they went home, I got 2 letters, one from Saul's girlfriend, thanking me for putting Saul up, and telling me that she enjoyed my book, and another from Fanny Ellison, thanking me for putting Ralph up and saying she enjoyed my book.
Well, you tell a similar story about Isaac Bashevis Singer, with whom you seem to have this great relationship. You saw each other all the time, and when you sent him your book...
Yes, Alma, yes. Alma liked it. That was his wife.
Right.
I don't even know that they knew what they were doing. They just, I don't know. Also, as a feminist, it's very hard to say, well, screw these wives. I can't say that either. It's just, it's a dilemma, Mm-hmm.
Would you say that any of these people actually inspired you? I mean, you learned your craft, but can you sort of trace it in some way?
I think they all inspired me. Because when you read something that extraordinary, it gets, you don't get jealous of somebody who's better than you are by far. You get jealous of people who aren't as good.
So who among them really stands out in that respect?
Saul Bellow. I think he opened up doors for all of us. We've all been following him since Augie March.
What's your favorite novel of his?
It was the one, I remember reading it and closing and saying, oh my God, this is it. It was, because he used language in a way, he made a literary language out of the language that we spoke, the way Odette's did in the theater, I mean, I'm an American Chicago born. Mm-hmm. That's a Yiddish construction, really, and he made it into the language of literature. And I was thrilled by that, just thrilled. And then Ralph was writing at that time, These guys were all writing the stuff, Invisible Man, not a bad book either. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, you read the stuff, you're elated.
Mm-hmm. In what way did Kazin's criticism influence you artistically?
His criticism of me or of the world?
No, his literary criticism.
Well, we agreed on a lot of it, and Faulkner, stuff like that. I thought he was quite accurate, and we discussed these things a lot before he wrote them, and,
Was there any point at which, he was critical of your work in a way, and I don't mean critical in a negative sense, mm-hmm. but helpful in his critique?
Yes, he was helpful, and he go over my stuff somewhat, but I don't know. I don't know. The other advantage, of course, was in terms of criticism, was that every book ever published came to our house.
So you read a lot?
Yes, I read everything. No, he wasn't too helpful.
Did he take the time?
Oh, sure. Oh, that he was only too willing to do.
Well, the character who looms the greatest in this scene, and who seems to have had herself the greatest impact on Alfred Kazin, and therefore on your marriage, was Hannah Arendt.
Mm. His boo, yes.
Hannah Arendt, the political philosopher, author of The Origins of Totalitarianism, and as you describe her, first,
Nazi.
I was going to say something else, but okay.
What were you going to say?
A first-class virago.
Oh, yes, that's true. That's the only
But
person.
there's a hilarious portrait, mordant, but wonderful. And I just want to read this. Or maybe, would you like to read?
No, go ahead.
Okay. Before, during, and after dinner, and at all times in between, she freely voiced opinions on everything. Again, my name wasn't really Anne. That was only a poor translation. It was actually Hannah. Avoid the parents, both Alfred's and mine, she cautioned me. Along the same lines, she dismissed Yiddish as a Low German dialect, and so as, quote, only a little Jew. There were quite a few such so-and-sos, though this was the first non-officially Nazi mouth from which I ever heard that phrase. Erich Heller, a distinguished literary critic of Czech origin, was dismissed as a Viennese hand-kisser. Saul Bellow, she told me, had thin lips, and people with thin lips couldn't be trusted. Americans didn't understand the genre, whatever genre it was that came up. Bufferin was better than aspirin. Alfred switched to Bufferin. Henry Schwartzman, a medical maladroit, if ever there was one, who let his mangy little dog climb around the examining table even if you were on it, this man was a brilliant doctor, so we all went to him. Ruth, Hannah's chief yes-sayer included. And no, Hannah Arendt wouldn't and couldn't sign a political petition because she was a naturalized citizen, and of course it made a difference. Americans knew nothing about politics. Toscanini couldn't conduct Beethoven or any other German composer, and so on and so forth. Most recently, of course, Arendt's name keeps surfacing because of her relationship with the German philosopher Heidegger. Who is now known as a Nazi sympathizer. When you asked Kazin how she could accept the accolades of the Germans, he answered, well, she forgives them. And your comment is, maybe she could, but I certainly couldn't. I didn't ask Alfred if he could. It would have been unthinkable. I don't know what you mean by that, but I seem to detect ever the slightest hint of a question about his moral stance.
About his what?
His moral stance.
Yeah, well, I can't imagine that he really forgave all Germans, but anybody who was bossy and ugly was his pinup girl, and that included many Germans too. I mean, he really, also, he had this funny thing about being a Jew. He's the one who really did not enjoy it. And he's the one who thought that was a disadvantage, and that the great cultures were German, and so, and I saw him in Germany. We were in Germany, and it was pretty awful. I couldn't even go outside. He was called a Gastprofessor of Americanistics, and he loved that. He just didn't. I don't know. What was the question?
Well, I was wondering whether you were kind of doubting whether he would have taken a moral position.
On Germany? Mm-hmm. I can't answer that. I just don't know. I mean, we had so many quarrels about the subject, I can't tell you. Knockdown, drag-out fights. And about Israel also. Mm-hmm. And I did mention there's a part in there when he and my father are arguing about Israel, Alfred being very anti-Israel because Hannah Arendt was. And she was anti-Zionist and so on, and there was a big fight about this, huge. But the two of them were arguing, and there was this huge bolt of thunder. I mean, right in my living room. And I think everybody thought God has sent this down, but I think both of them thought that God was telling the other guy something. It was really, but he was, I don't quite understand why he bought this line. I don't.
What was his fascination with this woman? I mean, was it? Look, she was clearly intellectual an intellectual superior. Is this what attracted him? Is this why everything that she said took on this aura?
As I say, I think any ugly woman who was bossy and arrogant was great. So I'm afraid this goes back to his mommy, but
Does it?
I think so. I don't know that she was his intellectual superior. I don't know that she was anybody's intellectual superior. She was certainly hard to understand, but that doesn't make you brilliant. I mean, she wrote the stuff in the New Yorker. I don't think I don't think one person read that stuff. I never heard them discuss it, you know. And when she came forth with these stupid ideas about, you know, and Americans were so infra-dig, and, you know, and German was the only culture, and Yiddish stank. I mean, I don't think that's intellectually superior to anybody. But to feel that way at that time was to say the emperor has no clothes.
Okay. In some ways, your book is, of course, a testament to the currents of the times that you write about. And you mentioned the assassinations of John Kennedy and Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King and the Vietnam War and all these terrible times. By the way, the thing that really shocked me and I guess disappointed me was when you talked about Adlai Stevenson's sexism. That was shocking. So chief among these currents, really, was the rising recognition of the achievements of women. Would you like to comment on that?
On what? On the
Your feelings at the time, and I know that this was very important to you, the place of women in American society. I mean, obviously
yes.
you suffered in some ways because of it.
Right.
And yet you told us a little while ago that you very early on felt it and felt that you somehow had this task to...
that it wasn't right. No, I think the women's movement was just about one of the most important things that ever happened in my life, ever. It was, bottom line, it made me understand I wasn't crazy. And we all were told we were crazy and that we were alone. And then suddenly, all these people, women, felt the same way. We really came out of the closet in a big way, and it was so sustaining, really, to me. Nora doesn't agree, but it was sustaining to me, and it meant everything to me. And so we became quite active. I did, and I schlepped my poor daughter to Washington so many times. I remember once she went to a woman's meeting. She was about 15, and she called and she said, "Mama, may I bring this woman home for dinner?" I thought, yeah, okay, but who's this woman and what does she want from my kid, you know? So Katie came back alone, and I said, "Where's the woman?" And she said she called her mother, and her mother said she had to come home. So we were all women, you know, no girls anymore.
As long as she hadn't called her husband, who said that she had to come home.
No, she was a kid.
Well, we meet all kinds of people whose names we recognize in your book. And some of them stand out for me anyway. The Trillings. And you don't have kind words to say about Diana Trilling.
No.
And you don't have kind words about Norman Podhoretz.
No.
We already spoke about Midge Decter.
Yeah. With that family, it leaves a little to be desired. And now the next generation is being equally obnoxious.
So what makes you so impatient with them? What makes you so impatient with them?
With who? Diana? Oh, Diana was, I mean, she had delusions of grandeur, and she was very, by the way, not liking women at all. Women were not in the game with her at all, since her whole reputation rested on her husband, it was kind of funny. And politically, she would write things. She got all mixed up with this partisan review crowd. And then it was a time when there were a symposia which it would say, one world, freedom or no freedom, and I knew she would be under no freedom because it was all very Cold War-ish too. And she would write letters to the Times saying, we view with disdain and repugnance so-and-so, it's political. I mean, it was without any, she hadn't earned any of that, and she was silly. I mean, she would say, I must go to the greengrocer. Who the hell went to a greengrocer?
So, on the other hand, there are some people that you appreciate, and you mention especially the few Gentiles in this circle.
Yes, poor
Francis
souls.
Steegmuller, Murray Kempton, and you say, I wondered if this had something to do with their not being Jewish, and therefore not worried about losing their manhood to literary women.
I stand
Do you believe
by
that?
Yes.
Yeah? Okay.
Yes, Stigma married to Shirley Hazard.
Right.
And that worked out fine. No, they didn't have that same take. It was very interesting. They were very courteous, courtly, and so on, but not
competitive.
No, not at all. In fact, some of the greatest encouragement I ever got from my work was from Murray Kempton and from Francis Steegmuller. And, no reason for it. Just
Gentility, how do you account for it?
I think they liked my work and didn't.
No, I don't mean vis-a-vis you, but in general.
They were courteous. They didn't make points by, shafting.
They didn't need to score.
No.
Right. Okay. So I'd like to point out two statements that you make, and both have to do with Alfred Kazin. I loved Alfred. He was handsome and brilliant, an extraordinary writer. He had justified my existence. Then again, Alfred could have given lessons in how to make people disappear. How do you reconcile this contradiction?
Well, it wasn't a contradiction, it was a passage of time.
It was a passage of time.
Yes, it was an evolution.
His, yours, your marriage?
His, I think. Oh, I don't know. It's hard to say. I was younger than he, and younger women get older and grow up, and they don't take on that same role, of being the cute little wifey. Mm-hmm. And especially when you have children, you can't fool with that one.
This is true.
So you have to take responsibility. And I think he just, I don't know, I think at bottom we really, odd as it seemed, though we almost killed each other, I think we loved it. It was a very passionate thing, and I don't regret that. A lot of people never have such a passionate romantic attachment. Do they?
Well, you've published some 8 other books. Which one do you like best?
Oh, that's hard to say.
Pick one of your children?
No, I remember once Rabbi was giving a talk, and someone said to him, what book of yours do you like best? And he said, that's like asking me if I like my nose better than my ear.
Pick one anyway and tell us about it at random.
I say the one that seemed the flukiest, most fortuitous, happiest book was a book of 3 novellas, actually, called Summer Situations. And that was a book I thought would never, who the hell was going to, it was like 3 albatrosses by Ann Birstein. But it did get published, and it did well, and I couldn't even read that royalty statement at first because it was black. I didn't owe them any money. And it was just, each one of them was such a labor of love because I never thought they would get published, that I was very proud of them. And then years later, this wonderful thing happened, which was, that's in there too, I guess. I was in Hannah and Her Sisters, there's a scene in which Mia Farrow is reading a book. And that book is Summer Situations. And it was like getting a love letter from, and I didn't know this guy, nothing. And everybody said, why did he do this, Anne? So I wrote to him and I said I was very gratified, that he had. And he said, thank you for taking the time to write. So I never did find out. And I couldn't ask him because that would have meant either I didn't understand my book or his movie. But it was just really to it for me.
Do you want to tell us a little about it?
Well, there are three different stories about what happens in the summer to people, it being different from what happens in the winter. And one is about two couples in Cape Cod.
Wellfleet. Wellfleet?
No,
in Wellfleet?
actually
No.
not.
Okay.
And they're sharing a house, and one of them falls in love with the other guy, and it gets all, it's quite funny, I think. My favorite scene there is when they're lying on the beach, and it's night, and he's licking her face, and she's saying, well, what does she know about lovemaking? It seems funny to have her face licked. Anyhow, he had a dog that was following them, and kind of broke up this this sex scene. The other story is about the son of a divorced couple, and he comes to spend his required time in the summer. It's called How I Spent My Summer Vacation, and then he just says he wants to go home early, and this just drives them insane, just upset the whole thing. And then the third one is set in Paris, and they're young, and they're young lovers, and this awful woman comes in and breaks it up. And that was hard for me to imagine, because I thought, a love story set in Paris, come on, this has been done approximately 90 million times. And then I could hear Raphael saying, another Madonna? So I figured it was a sort of classic theme that you had to do. And
Do you have fond memories of that book? You have fond memories of that book?
I do, just because I say it was pure joy to do it, and no hope of any reward at all.
And is there anything coming down the pike?
Yeah, there's another novel coming down the pike, maybe two, and then some stories. Although each time I decide I'm never going to write again. And I'm in between never going to write again, except maybe once.
Okay.
And then I took a trip to Eastern Europe, which affected me very deeply. And I wrote an article about it, about 60 pages. And it's neither an article nor a book yet, but I think I want to make that into a book, though it may kill me. It's very tough stuff, with Auschwitz and stuff. And those places in Eastern Europe where not a Jew remains.
Right. I understand your daughter lives in Israel?
No, not anymore. She's
anymore.
Here now. She's now in Princeton, another promised land.
This is true.
Yeah, but she was there for a long time.
You had rather strong reactions in a portion of your book to the French expression "ça ne se fait pas ici," it isn't done here. So I'm wondering whether your reaction to this phrase and to this attitude actually has become stronger or less strong as with the passage of time, shall we say.
That's interesting. I don't hear that anymore. I mean, in New York, nobody could possibly say that isn't done here, because it is.
Everything is, right.
Every once in a while, I'll go to Cambridge or something like that and feel icky. People got there for being good, and you were not supposed to rock the boat. I guess it's just an innate feeling, but I just don't hear that. Do you hear it much anymore? I think it used to be much more prevalent in the attitude, don't you? Than it is now. We're sort of more
They're different things, but they're different things that aren't done anymore, but there are always things that just aren't done in any given circle, don't you think?
Yes, that's true. That's absolutely true. And I don't know. I don't live in the suburbs. There used to be that your shades had to be a certain, lowered at a certain length, and so I don't know. as I say, in this place, it's hard to imagine what isn't done. But it was in France. When I was in Stanford, it was the same thing, a little kind of Amherst.
Are you fighting any windmills these days?
Hmm?
Are you fighting any windmills these days?
No, I think I'm just trying to stay alive. No, I'm not. Although I'm sure one could come up any minute.
Okay. Well, I've enjoyed this talk, and I'm wondering what our audience would like to ask, comment, questions.
In summer solutions,
What?
in some summer situations, the mean lady in Paris. Why don't you tell us who you based it on?
I based it on my imagination.
No fair.
Yes.
Can we get that book?
It's out of print, but I think if you go to Amazon, whom you hate, this lady is the counsel for the Authors Guild, and we don't like Amazon, but I love it, and they will get it to you. I think I would like it to. I'll try to get it into paper with the back and print.
You said that as your father was the bravest person you know, and as you get older, that matters more to you. I'm wondering why.
Why what?
Your father's bravery.
Why
impresses
that
you
matters so
more
much
as
to
you get
me?
older.
Because it was a kindness to everybody else. It really was. I mean, once I was being interviewed about that book, and I said to my sister, if you had one thing to say about Daddy, what would you say? And she said, he was always there. And he had a tremendous sense of responsibility. And so whether he was knocked around, he had knocked around plenty. He had to get up again because he had people who depended on him. And that's why I think it's great that he was so brave. Well, don't all talk at once.
All right. Well, this was very pleasant. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for the book. Thank you for coming and talking to us.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
And we'll keep our eyes open.
For my next windmill.
For the next windmill or the next publication. We'll look for it.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks for listening. For more information on the 92nd Street Y, New York, and all of our programs, please visit us at 92ny.org.